You are in the Leading in Crisis breakout today. Thank you so much for being here with us. We have Dr. Melvin Switzer, who spent 28 years with the Sacramento Sheriff's Department, with half of his career in the middle and executive ranks. Since retiring in 2004, he has worked as a leadership coach, trainer, consultant with small businesses, nonprofits, and public sector clients. His doctorate is in strategic leadership and an emphasis in leadership coaching. He is a professional certified coach and certified management consultant. You are in wonderful hands today. I have put in the chat the notes for this breakout, so you're welcome to check that out and open it up if you'd like. And you're also welcome to put in some question and answer, which we'll get to at the very end, the last 15 minutes of our session today. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Melvin and go at it.
Thank you, Renee. Hey, it's sure a pleasure to be with you folks this afternoon. I've often said from a professional perspective, there's no place I would rather be than working with a group of leaders. So I just welcome you and welcome your questions that we'll get to a little bit later during the breakout. So we're going to focus on leading in crisis. And this whole notion of COVID-19, really, if you think about it from a future study perspective, is what we call a wild card. It's something that was not anticipated. It wasn't a trend that we saw developing, and yet it has impacted us in a significant way. In fact, I heard an interesting statistic just earlier, actually it was yesterday, that they think that only 1 in 10 workers will experience work exactly the way it was before the pandemic occurred, which is really an interesting statistic. Well, in this whole notion of leading in crisis, I want to touch on 7 things in our time together today. And I wanted to tell you what those are up front. The first one is there to set the tone, be active, visible, and courageous. And we'll drill down in each of these in a little bit. Number 2 is to respond versus react. It's really about the role of emotional intelligence of you as a leader. The third is the power of communication and importance. I often make the comment that communication is the lifeblood of an organization. And in times of crisis, it's so important. Number 4 is to combat fear and instill hope and encouragement. This whole notion of being positive and inspiring, both in speech and in attitude, which is really important for our teams. 5 is to demonstrate empathy. As we've seen in this last year, people have been impacted in so many different ways, from having to work remote to being furloughed or laid off from their jobs, perhaps having loved ones who had COVID that may have been in critical care and yet could not even go and be with them under the circumstances. Number 6, to give staff a voice and up-to-date information that just helps assuage that need. And then finally, engage your leadership team. Don't try to go it alone as so many do. And leverage, if you will, those that are on your team. So those are the 7 areas we're going to dive down to, or drill down into, and we're going to go ahead and get started with that, with the first one there. So being active and visible. You know, when crisis occurs, all eyes turn to the leader. What's that person going to do? What's going on with their decision making? How is that going to impact us? Are we going to get furloughed? Are we going to come back to work? Are we going to get furloughed again? You know, all these questions, and people are looking to you as a leader to try to understand what's going on and for you to help them make sense of it. And so part of being this active and visible is literally on the front lines where you're visible as much as possible. And in the remote context, uh, obviously you can't be visible with them in the office, but checking in with them at least once a day to the extent that you can, or having their direct supervisor or manager check in with them. So there's this sense of connectivity and going on. There's a company called ProSci that puts on, does an annual change management survey. And year after year, the number one factor associated with successful change is active, invisible uh, leadership during the time that we're trying to bring about change. And so people want to know that you're in there with them, so to speak. And so, and in fact, conversely, in this survey, uh, the number one factor that contributes to change not going successfully is when there is a lack of leadership visibility during the change initiatives. So that's really important. Off to the side there, you see a picture. It says leaders set the tone. That's actually a floor puzzle that I had custom made. It's 5x5, and use it in team building workshops for an activity to help underscore the fact that we as leaders set the tone for others in our team, in our organization, whatever that may look like. Part of being active and visible is trying to get your arms around and make sense of what the issue is. And so it's really an important to take time to focus on critical success factors. Critical success factors are those things that are most important to maintain our competitive edge, to be successful in the marketplace. And generally, it's a pretty small list. There's so many things that we can focus our energies on, but if we can narrow it down to those things that are most important, maybe it's how do I pivot my business? Maybe it's how do I connect more personally with my employees? Maybe it's what kinds of products or services can we launch, or can we move to some kind of online format or something else? So what are those 2 to 4 most critical things to your success? If we can focus our energy on that, we can have a greater impact on a potential outcome, and keep from diverting energy to things that are less important, things that may not really be important at the end of the day. And so part of this whole process is understanding what are your concerns, where are you struggling? And as we'll talk about later, the extent to which we may want to communicate some of that to our team members. And the whole notion of being courageous. I wrote a book called Bold Leadership, Biblical Principles for Marketplace Impact. And when you look at a bold, you'll see that one of the synonyms is courageous. And it's having to face a crisis, yet controlling our fear. So it's not the absence of fear, but it's controlling the fear. Maybe those fears have to do with the finances. Maybe those fears have to do with just literally staying in business or maintaining our, our team. I know from earlier in the year when the pandemic first hit, and then things began to loosen up a little bit, some of my clients, business owners, had difficulty getting their employees to come back to work because they were able to collect more money through unemployment and stimulus than they could working. And so it really challenged them to be able to open the doors back up and have their staff back there. Drawing a little bit on my background in terms of incident management, some few simple steps to keep in mind. identify what's the problem we're trying to solve here, identify what are some potential resources that we can draw from, and how might we allocate those toward the issues. And part of that is looking at what are some different courses of action that I might be able to take to analyze those, ultimately to select one or more actions that then we implement to change or solve the problem in some way. But then taking time to debrief it. Oftentimes, as an incident commander, when I had a hazmat situation or I had a critical incident of some kind, or maybe there was a hostage situation or barricaded subject, bringing my team together to talk about what did we do right? What could we have done better in this circumstance? And this certainly applies tactically when we're managing our business in the light of what's going on today. And when this pandemic passes, rest assured there will be something else that comes along at some point in time that we need to be prepared to manage. So that's number two. Number one. Point number two is to respond versus react. If we look at some of Daniel Goldman's work on emotional intelligence, he said there's 4 domains, and I'm going to turn to my board here, and they're kind of like stair steps. And so the first step here is that self-awareness. To what extent are you aware of how your behavior impacts others? For example, in this crisis, you feel some uncertainty. You're worried about whether or not the company is going to be able to remain viable, whatever the case might be. And in that, you may respond or behave in ways that are undermining your leadership, but you don't understand that. And if you do understand it, that goes to step 2. With that understanding, can I manage my behavior differently in order to get better results? So the self-management, self-awareness, this is about you and your response to the pandemic or whatever crisis is before you. And interestingly enough, where there's different studies have shown that where there is a high level of emotional intelligence, almost any metric that you can use to measure company performance shows a direct correlation. In other words, you as a business owner or CEO, the higher your level of emotional intelligence by various metrics, the more likely your company is to be successful. The third step is social awareness. To what extent am I aware of what's going on around me? In other words, do I pick up on the vibes of my team members or my employees when they come to work? Do I notice that there's something wrong with them? And if I do, am I able to then tap into them? In other words, approach and say, hey, I noticed something seems to be wrong. Is there something I can do, or what's going on? Just to be able to connect with that employee or team member on a personal level in terms of what's going on. The third, or rather the fourth, is relational management. To what extent can I manage relationships around me that don't necessarily directly involve me? In other words, can we set up ways to help our team navigate some different challenges that they may be facing? And so these domains are important for us to think about as leaders. How am I managing myself? How am I managing the team? Because during that crisis, there's a variety of things that can occur: fear, uncertainty, conflict, but also opportunity can come out of that. And one of the things that you can help your team with to respond versus react is to help them focus. Remember, I talked about those critical success factors. We can actually leverage our team in that process and identifying and then working on strategies to impact those things that are most critical to our success. And so defining that common vision and helping define a direction it gives people a sense of purpose. It actually encourages the heart as they begin to move forward in working on different aspects. The third is this whole notion, the power of communication. I'm going to just draw a little face up here, and that could be any one of us. When change occurs, there's some blank space up in our minds. In other words, we don't know the answer to questions that we might have. And when we don't know the answer to that question or questions, it creates blank space. That blank space makes us uneasy, uncertain. It's not comfortable. And so people begin to look for information to fill that blank space. And so you and I as leaders, if we're not providing the right kind of information to people, then the gossip and other sources are going to fill that void. And so people will begin to look at sources that may not be nearly as good to fill that information void that they're feeling. So it's important for us to lead as leaders to make sure that we're giving our people the best information that we can. And one of the tips that's really important in providing that information is to use what's called structured messaging. Structured messaging is thinking about your audience and then identifying the 2, 3, 4, 5 key points that's most important for them to hear. And so it's communicating that message and doing it consistently and in use different formats. If you've can remember some of the marketing information that you've probably read, it takes 7 to 9 times for people to hear something before they might be interested in checking out that product. And so people need to hear a message multiple times before it starts to sit in. But they also need to understand the rationale. You see, about half the population would be what we call logic oriented, and the other half would be more people oriented. And so those folks that are logic oriented, they want to know the whys and wherefores behind the decisions or things that we're communicating. And so when we take the time to explain the rationale, people, as they hear it, they say, okay, that makes sense. And so without explaining the rationale, people are going to wonder, so why are we doing this? I don't understand. In fact, you'll hear them say things like that. I don't understand. It's because oftentimes we haven't explained the rationale as part of our messaging. One of the next thing to keep in mind is, depending on how critical the message is, we want to select our format or delivery method carefully. In other words, a very critical message, we want to try to have more personal interaction, being there if possible. I've got some figures on this slide that come out of a study, say that body language accounts for about 55% of the communication process. Voice inflection, another 38%, and the words we actually use, only about 7%. So think about that. In the pandemic era, we may be doing more texting or more emailing. And what do we do to try to put some voice inflection in it? We'll put, a dozen exclamation points, or we're bold and put in big letters a particular word, or we'll highlight something. We're trying to build in inflection into the communication process, and it doesn't work that well. So depending on the message, we may want to, go from written to phone. That gives us voice inflection there, or bump it up another level, like many of us are doing via Zoom, where we can actually see the other person. We can listen to their voice inflection and their words. And depending on the situation, we may want to make efforts, if at all possible, to actually meet with people where there's that physical presence as well. The last point I want to make here is to use different formats. Some of you are visual oriented, and so it's not as easy for you to pick up on things uh, if you have nothing to look at. On the other hand, some of you may be very audio oriented. And so you have to hear something and talk about it to process that information. Well, when we think about our teams, we've got some people that are audio oriented and some people that are visible oriented. And so, like we're doing in this PowerPoint, you can actually see me, but you can also see and read notes. And in fact, there's a handout that I provided that summarizes what we're talking about in this breakout. And so, trying to leverage different medium, if you will, to better connect and facilitate the communication process. Tip number 4 is to combat fear by instilling hope and encouragement, to be inspiring, positive, both in speech and attitude. And so undoubtedly you've had the time over the last almost a year now to think about COVID and think about this crisis and reflect on your own fears. But what are the fears of your staff? And I'm guessing that most of you have had an opportunity to listen to your staff and understand those fears. But that understanding is really an important part of the process, because when we understand it, then we can create messaging in order to instill hope and encouragement. And so a part of it is being expressive. When we're expressive, people sense more of our emotion, if you will, and we're expressive in our hope and in our messaging, then that gives hope and whatnot. I don't know if you noticed, but early on in some of the messaging that we saw on the TV or radio last March, in particular, April, you heard comments like, we're in this together. We'll get through this. We've been through this before, and we came out the other side. All those little things are meant to encourage and instill hope. And so when leaders are expressive in that way, that's important. The second thing is to be encouraging. And that goes hand in hand. The expressing is our level of excitement. Encouraging is really more the words that we use. And in this sense, it's a proactive kind of encouraging. It would sound something like this. Even though this seems insurmountable, if there was ever a team that could crack this nut, it's this team. And so it's instilling a sense of belief and hope in your team that we can navigate the challenges that are before us. And so, by the way, some of these come out of best practices and assessment that I use, and there's a corollary book called The Work of Leaders, based on a lot of research into best practices in leadership. The next bullet there is a shared vision. In creating a shared vision of what the future could look like. And one of the powerful things about this is a little axiom that I often use, and that is people support what they help to create. So we can engage our team in helping to create a shared vision of what we want to see happen. Then we get the hearts and minds, if you will, of our staff involved in it, in creating that positive future, and enlisting people to help with that process. Encourage the heart. It's a form of positive reinforcement. And it's almost in some areas a lost art. We feel like because of the busyness around us, we don't have time uh, to focus on platitudes. You'll hear some people, some leaders say, or some leaders have a feeling or a belief that, if I say too many positive things, it'll dilute the meaning. And so I only point out those things that are almost superhuman. But we have an opportunity to reinforce values or reinforce contributions by taking the time just to say thank you. Hey, I know that this was difficult for you to get done in this period of time. I just want you to know how much I appreciate you taking the time to do that. So recognizing the contributions. Uh, and I try to make that habit um, in, uh, in, in various settings, excuse me, in various settings. For example, just yesterday, I walked into a store and there was a fella pushing a broom around. And I said, hey, thanks for helping to keep this place looking nice. Now, that person didn't work for me, but I wanted to just give him a word of encouragement for the task that he's doing. Because even though menial is some of us may think that is, it plays an important part in the aesthetics of that particular business. And so recognizing those contributions. And then finally, they're celebrating victories, taking time to celebrate victories along the way. Hey, we got this part of the task done. So identifying those uh, milestones and recognizing our progress rather than waiting until the whole thing is done. Tip number 5 is to demonstrate empathy. I put a little a definition of empathy here: the action of giving someone support, confidence, or hope, persuasion to do or to continue something. So taking a few minutes and just recognizing the actions of someone else and understanding the difficulties that may be present for them to accomplish that. Maybe sacrifices that they made, maybe other things that they did in order to get that done, or to recognize, each of our team members is a whole person. They have feelings, they have hopes, they have dreams, they may have families. They've had happy times, maybe some sad times, and all this that goes on. But when we demonstrate empathy, what we're really communicating is, you matter. I care about you. I appreciate what you've done. It shows that we're concerned about them as people, not as a means to get work done, so to speak. It's a way of saying, you matter. I feel your pain, or I understand the difficulty that this is putting on you and your family. And then looking for maybe tangible ways to demonstrate that empathy. I remember one time as a commander of a facility, it was a correctional facility, and I had a single mom. Her washing machine went out. She had small children, and you can imagine what that's like when you're a working mom. You've got small kids. The washing machine breaks down. That could be traumatic, right? And so we sold tickets for lunch, and we barbecued chicken breast sandwiches, and then we raised, I think we raised $700 in one lunchtime that we were able then to give to her as a blessing, that then she was able to go out and buy a brand new washer. Did that demonstrate that we cared about her and her situation? Yeah, it did. And we did care. And so, what can we do to demonstrate empathy uh, for our people in these challenging times that we face? And some of that comes from just taking the time to understand our employees, understand what's going on in their lives. Sometimes we're so wrapped up in our own lives and our own concerns that we fail to take time to tap into our team members and find out what's going on in their lives, and communicating in a very tangible way that they matter to us. Tip number 6 is to give staff a voice and up-to-date information. And I know, some of this we understand now, but there was a lot of unknown, and there still are, regarding this pandemic. But engaging them in question and answers as best you can, letting them share their concerns with those others, exchanging perspectives. I like the way Covey put it in 7 Habits of Highly Effective People: seek to understand and then to be understood. And I often use the analogy, I've done a variety of training on Market Street in San Francisco. And if you're on the ground floor of one of the buildings, high rises on Market Street, you look out, you're going to see bicycles, buses, business people, buildings across the street. It's a pretty limited view. But if I'm up on the 20th or 30th floor, I have an entirely different view. I may be able to see the Golden Gate, Alcatraz, sailboats out in the bay, see over a variety of buildings. Now, if I ask the person on the first floor, hey, what do things look like? They have a particular view. And if I ask the person on the 30th floor what things like, their description of the view is going to be very different. And so exchanging perspectives means the person on the first floor talking about what it looks like to them, and the person on the 30th floor saying, here's what it looks like for me. And so if you think of 2 concentric circles, 30th floor, first floor, the more we exchange perspectives, it brings us over, and those circles begin to overlap. The extent to which they overlap is shared meaning, shared perspective. It's what we sometimes refer to as being on the same page. And so exchanging perspectives is important. In this crisis time, another really important tip is to be receptive to the ideas that people have. When we're receptive, we're willing to listen and evaluate ideas that our team members may have. And it just could be that some of that would contribute to our success. I was working with a leader one time, and he scored very low on being receptive. And I asked him, so if somebody comes to you and they have an idea, how do you process that? He said, well, I quickly think about it. I start asking them questions. And then if it doesn't make sense, I'll dismiss it. End of story. And on the other hand, best practices would be, first of all, not being willing to listen without deluging them with a variety of questions. Hear them out, maybe have some follow-up questions, process the information, and then come back and say, generally one of 3 things. I like your idea, let's move on it. 2, the ideas that fit with other things that we're doing, or maybe it's somewhere in the middle. Hey, I like this part, but I don't see how we could get around this part. If you had a solution to this part of it, I think that might work for us. So often, when employees have ideas, they feel like it goes, in fact, I've heard this description, the black hole. Well, I sent the idea and I never heard anything back. And so we sometimes call that the black hole. You throw it in and it just kind of disappears. we never hear anything back. And so part of being receptive is to circle back. Um, but how we approach that will create an environment that communicates to other employees, I am interested in your ideas or I'm not. And what that sounds like is when the employees to get together and somebody says, hey, I've got this idea. If others in the room have not had a good experience, they're going to say things like, oh, you're wasting your time. He or she has their own way of doing things. They're not really interested in ideas. And so you'll never hear the idea where there's a belief among the team that you're not receptive, you're not interested. The next thing there is to engage people in the process, looking for ideas, helping them identify them. As a middle manager and an executive in my first career, when I would move in and start working with a new team or group of people, I would ask every single person, what are those things that you've thought about? Doggone it, if I was in charge around here, I would change this. And what I found was so often there were little irritants that people didn't feel like they had the power to change, but I could. And I would start changing those little things and giving them the credit. Hey, so-and-so had this idea. That really sounds good. Let's do that. And so not only did it create an atmosphere that I'm interested, I'm listening, but I was acting on their ideas and giving them credit. And so that encouraged the flow of ideas. But in this time, could we develop some kind of mechanism or opportunity to engage them in a particular way, like a COVID-19 task force? Probably a lot of organizations have those now, but there could be, for example, going back to an earlier slide about critical success factors, we could identify a particular product or service that we need to develop or refine and identify a team around that and have them engaged in that process. I was sitting on a plane coming back from Washington, D.C., where I'd spoken at a conference, and there was a turnaround CEO in the chair next to me. And he talked about going into this company that was just about really ready to go belly up. And he said it was very clear one of the things they needed to do was bring new products to market. And so he actually identified a number of teams for each of these. I think there were 20 new products, and they had less than a year to prepare those to take to market. People didn't think it could be done. And yet each of those teams came to the executive group and reported on their progress on every week or every other week. And that high profile and audience with the executives underscored the importance and engaged the people in a way that at the end of that year, they had the 20 new products ready for market and really had a big celebration. One of the things that I'm sure some of you have or will maybe still wrestle with is the whole notion of working with remote team members. I remember I was used to being in the office all the time when I was with the sheriff's department as a captain, and I looked forward to coming to work in the morning, and I'd walk by different work areas and talk to people and whatnot. All of a sudden I retired and I had started this consulting business. This is 2005. All of a sudden it's just me. And I found myself really feeling isolated. In fact, that was probably the biggest shift for me, was going from used to working with a lot of people and being around them to working solo. And so that was a real change for me. That was probably the hardest part of the transition. And so I literally realized within a week or two that I had to connect with people more. And so I started setting up these coffee times where I could connect with them. But how can we help people feel connected? I was working on a project with HP, and this particular manager had employees in other countries. And so I actually had conversations with these employees in other countries to see what their experience is like and whatnot. And some of the things that they talked about was, we're celebrating not only birthdays and other, maybe culturally appropriate kinds of things that were going on in those different countries, but looking for ways to come alongside of each other and connect with each other to build relationships and friendships, even though they were, thousands of miles apart. And so understanding how you're connecting with your people is important. One of my clients who's had remote workers around the United States for a number of years, is a high-tech company. He said he's found that the immediate supervisor or manager should be reaching out to their employees minimum of once, preferably twice a day. In the morning to talk about, what are you going to be working on today? What questions do you have? What concerns do you have? But then following up at the end of the day, how did it go? Were you able to get this done? What support do you need tomorrow? And checking in. And it provided a level of accountability, but it also communicated a sense of connectivity and interest and relationship between this remote worker and his or her supervisor or manager. Another thing that's really important is to give up-to-date information as best we can. Now, there were a lot of unknowns, and there still are to some degrees. Right now, probably one of the biggest unknowns is around the vaccine. Is it safe? When can I get it? How do I get it? Are they going to mandate it? I mean, there's all these different rumors and things going on out there. And so providing up-to-date information or links to information that they or their family members can have access to. But bear in mind, as a leader, we don't have to have all the answers. And it's appropriate to say, I don't have that information. I am watching for it. I will look for it. And the extent that I can get that, I will pass it on to you. When I was still with the sheriff's department, I went to executive staff meetings on a monthly basis. When I'd get back, I'd send that information out. And one day, one of my managers came to me and he says, do you know that people from elsewhere in the organization are coming to talk to our people? And I said, no, why? He said, well, those minutes that you put out on your own? I said, yeah. He said, you're the only one of the executives that's doing that. And so our people are better informed. Well, word has got out, and people in other parts of the organization are coming to find out, hey, what do you hear? What's the latest on this? And he said, our people really like being in the know like that. And I was trying to keep them in the know. I just didn't understand, at the time, that maybe that wasn't happening in other places and the positive impact that was having on our staff. So we move into this last step, engage your leadership team, or if you don't have a team of leaders, engage key members of your team, people that will help make it happen, if you will. I just want to encourage you not to try to go it alone. In these uncertain times and all this that's going on, it's really easy to feel isolated. It's really easy to feel like I have to carry the whole load. I've got to manage this all myself. And that's one of the quickest ways to burnout, is to try to do this all on your own. So don't go along on your own. Break things down to smaller tasks. Delegate it out to others. So that not only will that engage them, it will help lighten your load. And if you're in a larger company where you have various levels of, supervisors and managers, we want that information to cascade down through the various levels to get to the folks at the grassroots level. And so that may involve the first line managers or supervisors having work unit discussions with their employees about what's going on, about what's being developed, things that may change, etc. But it's also a chance for your first line supervisor managers to gather information, to engage their team in brainstorming, and then send that information back up uh, to the executive level. And so this, cascading information down is great and important, but let's bring information back up from the bottom so that we have a more accurate view of what's going on at the grassroots level and what we can do or use that information, how we can use that information to make more or better informed decisions so that we can help our team thrive, pun intended there, to thrive through the crisis and not just try to live through the crisis. Well, I want to open it up for some questions. I think Renee's been monitoring, looking for questions you might have. So I'll let her get a couple of those out. And we'll also unmute your mic so that you can ask a question live if you hadn't already got it in. Renee, what you have?
Great, thank you. Well, this was a great breakout. I really got a lot out of it. I'm reminded to, identify some of those fears that we might have and then combat that with hope and encouragement. So thank you so much. I think that's great. We did have a question come through, and so here it is. How are we to handle the fear of those who have stated that they're too afraid to come back?
Yeah, that's a challenge, and certainly we have to navigate what what requirements or guidelines that have been put in place by local officials. But by the same token, it's an opportunity to educate them. And at the end of the day, there's various levels of resistance sometimes. And so let's identify what those points of resistance are, and then identify how steps that can be taken to undermine, if you will, or remove those levels of resistance. I like to use the analogy of an onion. There's different levels. Let's peel the layers of that onion away by providing the right information, making adjustments as necessary in the workplace, etc. At the end of the day, it may be that we need to have one of those more difficult conversations, with an employee. It's what I call coaching for performance improvement. And in fact, in my role as an executive coach, this has been the number one topic of leaders over the years. I know I need to have this conversation, a difficult conversation. How do I have that conversation? And as leaders, sometimes we just have to have those conversations. And ultimately, while we want to maintain those employees and bring them back, we still have an operation, a business, or an organization, department, whatever your context is, that we have to operate. It could be, in some cases, we don't have the right team members.
Great. Someone is requesting to see if the slides you provided today would be available to them. Is there a way that you might be able to share the slides that they would be able to get?
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, great.
Renee, I'll give it to you, and then I'm not sure I'll let you take care of that, or they can email me and I can send it to them. We can do both.
Great. So what we'll do, and someone's also requesting if this recording will be online, and it will be on the Thrive Conferences page. So you're welcome to go there to find that. There are resources that you can find on there, and we'll go ahead and put your slides in there as well. So be looking out for the recording in the next couple days. They will be inundated with all the recordings, so they'll be putting those on. You'll see those shortly.
Hey, Renee, this is a great opportunity. I'd like to hear from some of the people on in the breakout. What would you add? What one or two things would you add that you think would be most critical, or you found to be most critical in leading in crisis? So, what would you add to what I presented?
Great. I did ask for those who would like to unmute themselves. You're welcome to and ask your question or add in your input.
I'm sorry, Merle, that I came in at the last because I was at a doctor appointment, so I just wanted to jump on. So I'm sorry I didn't hear it. But I'm assuming you did talk about employees who don't want to come back to the office. Is that what I heard earlier? They don't want to come back?
Yeah, somebody asked the question.
Yeah, I've been having that same issue myself. So I look forward to looking through your slides.
Yeah, and we can certainly talk offline as well.
Yeah.
Hi, I have a question, and I also jumped in a little bit late, and I don't know if you covered this topic, but one of the things that I've been dealing with throughout the pandemic is that, and of course, the word of the pandemic is not the pandemic or COVID, it's pivot, and everybody seems to be talking about pivot and pivoting and anything that can be stemmed from the word. And my question to you is, how do you navigate the unknown of the pandemic when you can't really plan around too many topics, too many plans even, because the future is in fact so uncertain, and there are so many guided conversations around believing in the pandemic and not believing in the pandemic, and complying with the rules and regulations and laws and not complying with them. It's difficult not to get caught up in that whirlwind of issues that are going around and that seem to be confusing a lot of people and creating a lot of controversy and opinion around something that should be very straightforward. That's just for me a little bit hard to understand. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I'll go back to something I said right toward the beginning, and that is taking time to identify your critical success factors. Let's take our eyes off the pandemic, and certainly there's some unknowns, and we can. I get the mental picture of a boat in the ocean. The wind is blowing, and I can sit there and I can let that wind blow me wherever it's going to blow me, and just, quote unquote, enjoy the ride. Or can begin to think, okay, what are the factors critical to my success? And usually that's a pretty short list. When you look at some of the literature around strategic thinking, it says maybe 2 to 4 things are critical to our success. Success being to remain or maintain our competitive edge in the marketplace, to remain viable or successful in the marketplace. And so what are those things most critical? What do we know? What don't we know? In fact, there's a learning process called problem-based learning. And it starts out, what do we know about this issue? What don't we know about this issue? And let's build on what we know, and we'll either make some assumptions about what we don't know, given the best information we have, so that then we can move forward in some way. And I'll give you just a quick analogy or this story about that. There was a group up in Canada, and there was a utility company, and they had these power lines that went through these back countries. after big snowstorms like we've just experienced here in California, up in the Sierras, many of the power lines would break because of the snow and ice would weight them down. And then of course, large groups of people would be out of power. And so they brought this group together to do some strategic thinking about how do we deal with this, because we don't know when those storms are going to come through, and it takes time to get the equipment and personnel in there. Long story short, they were doing some brainstorming, and somebody says, well, we do know there are a lot of big bears in that area. If we could get those bears to scratch your back on the utility pole, it would cause the pole to waver, which would cause the lines to shake and the snow would fall off. That crazy little idea ultimately led to the company employing helicopters, who, as soon as the storm was over, would fly the helicopters over the power lines. The downdraft would cause the snow and ice to fall out. And so they solved that problem. And so kind of bringing it back into this conversation, engage in conversation around strategic thinking, critical success factors. What do we know? What we don't know? And let's move forward with the best information that we have. Does that make sense?
It does. I was, and thank you for that response. I was really keen on understand, and I love the way you brought that together. But one of the things that I was keen about and wanting perhaps a little bit of further light was leadership is about leaders. And again, I think that one of the things that we've seen throughout this pandemic is that there is almost a sense of confusion about who the leader that we should follow is, because again, there seems to be so much polarization around the pandemic itself. And so it's even hard to understand, well, do we follow the rule or do we oppose the rule? Do we, and one of the things that for me has always been very clear is, as long as it's a law, I need to follow it. There's no gray spots or gray areas around what is legal. And so for me, it has been about that. But again, even in that sense, today you see people that are opposing the law and that are reacting to the law because they're saying it's unconstitutional. And so even in the workplace, it becomes such a moving factor because there are people that want to follow the law and other people that are rebelling the guidelines and not wearing the mask or not wanting to manifest their attitude towards one or the other because they're wearing the mask or not wearing the mask. So that was more my point in regards to the leadership factor surrounding the pandemic.
Yeah. Well, given your particular context, a leader is the active agent in leadership. And so at some point, in our own companies, we have to be that active agent, and we have to say, okay, here, as I understand it, here are the rules by which we need to play with, and that's the way we're going to move forward. Yes, there's other perspectives, and part of it comes from the fact that it's kind of unprecedented. In other words, most leaders have never experienced something like this. And so there's a lot of uncertainty around that. There's a lot of tentativeness around what I should or shouldn't do. And I appreciate the fact that your perspective is I should follow the law. And that's a very valid and appropriate response. There are others who say, I want to question that. And there's an avenue for them to question that. But ultimately, each of us are responsible for our own thoughts, feelings, and actions. And as a leader, I want to set the tone and move forward with my organization in the best way that I can. And
Yeah.
there's going to be these other voices around us that may say otherwise.
I have a simple question I want to ask. As lead, and this has been great. I want to say thank you first of all. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
As leaders leading in a pandemic, what would be your suggestion? The number one thing we should be doing as leaders. I pastor a church with congregation of mostly probably 75% seniors, and the rest are mixed age. But we are not in service. We're not holding service. Just my wife and my children are holding service on Sundays.
Mm-hmm.
But what would be your suggestion for us as a leader? What we should be doing in this time till this pandemic is over?
The first thing that comes to my mind is understanding that we have a faith in an almighty God who is unchanging. And so in times of pandemic or uncertainty, we have a rock that we can anchor to that doesn't change. And if we look back through the millennia, there have been all kinds of pandemics, crises, governments falling, whatever else. And God has remained the same. He is just as faithful, just as caring, just as in control as he's ever been. And so when we're anchored to him, we're anchored to an unmovable rock that helps us maintain our sense of equilibrium when everything around us may not seem that way.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Other questions, other comments? Anything that you would add based on your experience?
Well, my name is Louise, and I just joined a little bit later. I think I joined when you started point number 4.
Yeah.
So I kind of lost point number 1 and 3, but so far I've been so blessed. Thank you so much. This is really meaningful. And yeah, based on my experience, actually I lead only only like a group of about 15 youngster from high school student to college students. So I think it's what is important. The most important is for me, not only just to, I agree that you have to connect with them, but I don't know if will be a questions that you can answer or not. But to be honest, I'm gonna have a hard time to connect with them just because of the age gap. I'm in the mid 30, late 30, and the one that I lead is like they are teenagers. So been struggling with the age gap actually.
Well, the first thought that comes to my mind is seek to understand. What is it in terms of looking at it from their eyes, through their perspective? What is life like for them? What are the issues that they face? And so as we seek to understand, then oftentimes people are more willing to listen. As a leader, I've found it very helpful to ask questions. In other words, would you be open to talking about what it's like for you? Would you be open to hearing a different perspective? Because when we ask questions like that and they choose to answer, they've opened the door to let you in. As opposed to, you know what, when I was your age, I did this, or if you just do this, it would work for you. And there's a natural barrier oftentimes that comes up. But when we ask questions or ask for permission, in most instances, people will open the door. And when they've opened the door, there's less resistance to what it is you have to say. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think. Thank you so much, Dr. Switzer.
My pleasure, Luis. Anyone else? Well, if there's not, it's been a joy to be with you today. Here's my phone number, my email address. I'm happy to have a follow-up question if you want to dive deeper in one of these points. If there's something that came to mind that you weren't comfortable in asking, or whatever the case happens to be, I'm here to serve however I can.